Good afternoon, everyone. And Magda, thank you so much for helping us enrich our learning here at Fordham, but also the broader community at large by having this, phenomenal uh, forum for us to discuss perspectives across disciplines. Um, before I start, a few things on the agenda. I will say a little bit about how I see and understand Africana studies and what it can offer us, and I'm approaching. Uh, the reason why I really wanted to have this conversation with Derek, and especially given uh, I think the many historical affinities, uh, but in very different historical contexts and circumstances that I believe might bring some insights to enriching my own scholarship. So at the outset, I should make it clear that for me, this is a matter of really trying to learn from others across other disciplines, while at the same time hoping that there will be growth in all of our understanding, and especially mine in this context. So, a brief overview of Black studies. So, Black studies or Africana studies more broadly is an interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approach to studying and understanding the historical, social, cultural, and political experiences of African people and African descended people across the diaspora. The field here at Fordham University, as well as many other national universities and colleges around the country, emerged from Black college students' demands with support from their student and faculty allies and supporters during the mass protest movements of the late 1960s and early 1970s. From the outset, a disciplinary focus of the goal of Africana studies was to transform and alter the deficiency of traditional curricula, especially in history, that limited our understanding of the Black experience um, through because it was heavily encoded through Eurocentric paradigms. And wanting more to center the study of people of African descent in the university canon by linking academic teaching and scholarship with how we've understood African American protest traditions, especially for citizenship and social and civic engagement. And so, a big part of the field is to raise critical questions about uh, what is the place of scholarship and finding certain truth claims or historical facts that can help us better understand um, the lives of African Americans next to the broader counterparts across the Black diaspora. And the field has emerged to sort of go beyond just the racial factor to also include class, gender, and sexuality. And in this sense, I've seen Africana studies as not something that is set in stone, but is significantly um, represented by this sort of spirit of having a laboratory for multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary approaches that could inform uh, even outside of Black studies. And what I'm actually pushing for is looking outside of Black studies to see if we can find other methodological inquiries that could help us further this. And in spite of the academic jargons and such, um, I view this forum that Magda and I have put together as something where it's not just scholars in conversation, but we want the public as much as possible to come around the table. So a big part of me, for me, is looking forward to when this will actually also be possibly uh, in in person. So I'm going to share my screen here. So in that spirit of the sort of laboratory aspect that I was talking about here, I want to just briefly give an overview of what my research has been looking into for the past several years, and in the process get some of Professor Penslar's perspective on, how I'm thinking about this, and how can we think about it also along the line of Jewish studies, to better inform my insights into my understanding of citizenship. So this is a very critical and important time actually to be talking about African Americans and Haitian history, and connection, especially within the context of immigration, having seen the images that people have been looking at, throughout the globe of thousands, what were said were several thousands of people at the U.S. border trying to enter the United States. And so let me just give a brief start to this. Uh, and let me start by a quote by a Haitian migrant while detained in Puerto Rico in the 1980s. She had this to say, quote, "We are asking why you treat us this way. Is it because we are Negroes? Why are you letting us suffer this way? America, don't you have a father's heart? Haven't you thought we were humans, that we had a heart to suffer with and a soul that could be wounded? Give us back our freedom. Why, among all the nations that immigrate to the United States, have only the Haitians known such suffering?" So unquote. So beginning in the 1970s, tens of thousands of Haitian refugees began sailing a dangerous 700-mile stretch of ocean streams from the southeast region of the Caribbean Sea Basin and northeastward into the Atlantic seaboard of the United States. Migrants would often take flight from the country during the cover of night, hoping to evade the punitive eye of military surveillance, as Haiti was under military dictatorship for much of the 60s, 70s, and early and mid 80s. To take flight from the country, propelled as they would land in places like Florida. They would often be detained by the U.S. military, the U.S. Coast Guard, either in Guantanamo Bay or in Puerto Rico. And so, and throughout the really throughout the 70s and 80s, of the 4,000 or more Haitian migrants who had been processed by immigration services in the 1970s, no refugee was actually granted asylum. So we fast forward to today, we are seeing the same images of Haitians being captured and immediately detained in preparation to be deported. So it's very interesting that we could see this kind of migration, which in many ways is what represents people's images of the trans migration currents between Haiti and the United States. Um, but historically, I wanted to try to sort of uh, inform our understanding of the longer span of migration history between the two countries. I think it is most Americans are not aware of the fact that Haiti and the United States are not only the earliest or the oldest republics in the Western Hemisphere, but by virtue of that, that also means they have had the longest running political migration history between the two countries, as anyone else in the globe, in terms of the two countries and their specific histories. So, um, so to see Haitians crossing here may have become in our mind a sort of a recurring message as to what type of migration flows we expect of Black bodies in terms of the two countries. And yet, uh, the story is completely reversed if we were to look at the 1790s as the Haitian Revolution is taking place, up until really the 1860s. Um, in fact, while the migration of African Americans to other lands outside of the United States is often thought of in the context of Liberia, more people, more African Americans settled in Haiti, um, uh, than settled more African Americans settled in Haiti from the 1790s to the 1860s in total than would ever have traveled to Liberia, which did not really become a state until the 1840s. And also, in fact, between in the 1820s alone, the number of African Americans who settled in Haiti uh, numbered, was twice that of what settled in Liberia until after Reconstruction, I believe. So, uh, to just give a brief history of where this migration is coming from in terms of its currents, uh, so on January 1st, 1804, Haiti declared its independence, right? Something remarkable took place in the French colony of Saint Domingue, as it was known then in the late 18th century. So Haitian revolutionaries fought a revolution between 1791 and 1804 that completed a 13-year struggle. And right after, in establishing their country, they said, quote, we render the country independent and to enjoy the liberty consecrated by the blood of the people of this island. In the wake of revolution, French planters fled Saint Domingue. Many of these planters headed to the United States, accompanied by their human property and thousands of free people of color. In fact, the population of New Orleans by the decades of the 1810s will have doubled. The black population of New Orleans will have, Louisiana will have doubled in part because of this migration of Haitians into the United States. So here we have some of the earliest cross changes between people. Southern planters rightly suspected that the political sensibilities of their slaves and of freedmen would be affected by this influx. And of course, there were notable repercussions of the revolution throughout the American South. Conceivably, Haitian revolutionaries could inspire African Americans, North and South, to challenge a fatal contradiction on which American liberty was customarily sustained, um, which is white freedom as defined by black slavery. So the suspicion was not unprecedented, especially given the fact that African Americans already had, uh, it's always been interesting to me why it is that we've labeled enslaved runaways fugitives when, in many ways, throughout the Caribbean and elsewhere, we call them maroons, which has more of a sort of political implication that one is not uh, simply seeking refuge away from enslavement, but really going back to grabbing a freedom that they were taken out of, right? So this sense of captivity. So the maroon aspect, as far as many Caribbean historians are concerned, has more of a sort of gravity to it in describing the movement of African Americans. So, of course, the Southern planters were right to be suspicious in terms of what radical possibilities the influx of revolutionary sentiment reverberations could have on their own enslaved population. There had been, even in the American Revolution itself, Lord Dunmore's proclamation, which motivated African Americans to fight for their freedom. And of course, more African Americans, as is generally known, fought on the side of the British more than they did in the U.S. for the side of the Patriots. And this is only something that can be understood within the context of freedom is really whoever provides it. That's a single one loyalty. So by the 18th, by the mid point of the decade of the 1810s, this movement to actually expel some of the free black population that had come out of the American War of Independence experience, as well as manumission throughout the North, really started causing some type of jealousy as to how to deal with this population of denizens, sort of not enslaved but not quite free also. And of course, the uh, while you had folks like Benjamin Franklin, who uh, was involved in some anti-slavery activity, you had the perspective of men like Jefferson, who thought perhaps the best thing is to expel them. Um, and and in this, the American Colonization Society in 1816 really emerged to sort of develop programs that would send African Americans back to Africa, and in the process, they would also spread Christian civilization to Africa. Sort of this idea of a Afro-Saxon in a way is what I would call it. Anyhow, so this is just to show here there is a historical pattern of constant movement. I often think of black folks in this side of the Atlantic, in the Western Hemisphere, as always being defined among some of their more politically central identity by constant movement and search for a freedom that is completely secured by citizenship. So, um, but to get at the core of this here, the person that I am foremost interested in within this context of African American immigration to Haiti is an individual by the name of Prince Saunders. This is him here, and he was remarkably born in 1775 in April, actually a few days before the Battle of Lexington would begin everything. His own father was himself a service member and the Connecticut militia that served the in the American forces. And while he was born enslaved in Connecticut, he would eventually um, get his freedom, and in the process, uh, um, was able to actually even attend Dartmouth College, which at that point was called the Moores Charity School, which was primarily established for indigenous people and with funding from societies in Britain. Uh, and in this case, and of course later would develop into a school primarily for young white men. But so this would make Saunders technically one of the first, if not the first, graduates of an Ivy League institution. Um, so here, let me just go in a little more about what it is that I'm trying to do here with this book project. So in here, I'm going to address some of the issues that I see in the scholarship and how we talk about Haiti and African Americans in the 19th century. So this is a map of some of the settlements of where people went and settled, and in this as I'm speaking, I want you to sort of pay attention to the fact that I am discussing Haiti here in the 19th century, especially before the 1850s, as one state. That is because after Haiti became independent, it entered into a union by way of invading the Dominican Republic, uniting the entire island, and it did not get much pushback. It became one state. So, given that history, I just want to address the fact that uh, what you understand to be the Dominican Republic uh, today is not really featured here in this context. Because if you see, um, they were going to Haiti, but here, Samana, which still has a historical population of African Americans, people of African American descent, Santo Domingo and Puerto Plata and other places received some of the migrants too. That's because it was all under the jurisdiction of the Black Republic. Um, but given that, and the reason why Prince Saunders is a major figure in here is because he is the prototypical um, American Haitian citizen who would be the one to actually uh, become the focal point that tries to bring together on the table African American leaders, their white allies in the U.S., next to British abolitionists and the Haitian state, um, by primarily linking with folks like Thomas Clarkson and Henry Christophe, who had established a kingdom in the north. So this is another point that I want to make clear. Haiti in this period, um, in the earliest period, was actually split into a southern republic and a northern kingdom, but African Americans were going to both. And then Haiti would eventually become the separation or the fracture was finally united in 1820, and then but we're not talking about the specificity of the two places. Um, but anyhow, so given that Haiti's immediate post-revolutionary uh, situation was one in which you had this problem of diplomatic sequestration by many of the Euro-American powers. Not that contact was not happening, but much of it was sort of in this troubled place of trying to get a place, their own position within the international community. But that effort is constantly being frustrated by the United States and its and other European powers. There's a tendency in the scholarship to often see Haiti as not quite the promise that it thought it was going to become for especially for African Americans, and this is this belief it tends to have become a convention in the historiography in terms of how historians talk about this migration, namely because of the estimated 6,000 to 13,000 people, African Americans, who settled in Haiti between 1824 and 1827. A substantial number of them returned to the U.S., almost half, really, by mid century. But in racing to disqualify this political endeavor as nothing more than a failed attempt at Black nationalism, the historiography really sort of neglects the fact that exiling to Haiti and returning to the United States uh, serve, as far as I'm reading it from my own historical interpretation, really served as a demonstration of an alternative outlook on freedom and citizenship. It's what I call an exercise in exilic nationalism to shift the constructive ideas of how we frame citizenship away from a purely internal national discourse dominated by white Herrenvolk supremacy in the United States uh, to something that is more global and universal and can be therefore transnational. So I've I take the position that a failure of resettlement or a failure of any type of settlement within the context of this history does not in itself means this is a failure of ideology. And with regards to ideology here, I think I'd like to quickly highlight some terms that will be useful in you understanding where I'm coming from. So I'm working with this concept of exilic nationalism, which is where I am hoping to, dive a little bit with Professor Penslar about um, this concept of exilic nationalism is to say that African Americans uh, who were traveling, especially a person like Prince Saunders, who had Haitian citizenship, became ministers in different positions in the government, traveled between the UK and the United States to connect these different counterparts, all in a search for trying to convince African Americans to resettle in Haiti are people who I see as go-betweens, and they are not, as Prince Saunders did, not trying to escape what they believe is naturally theirs in terms of American nationalism and citizenship, but they want to go outside of the boundaries of it to reform it. And one way to do that is sort of contrast models by literally living out what this would look like. So Prince Saunders is sort of the premier exilic national who is both Haitian and African American, sees themselves as American as well as Haitian in terms of his travels, and believe that if, being in Haiti, he can strategically position himself in such a way that will demonstrate to people what genuine citizenship looks like. And so I put together the concept exilic nationalism to explain that. And I in part came through this concept by having read a book called Muslim Zion, which looked at the experiences of establishing the state of Israel in 1947 next to that of Pakistan simultaneously, both becoming sort of religious ethnic based states, but at the same time trying to secure a project of secularism within that. Uh, so this is one way that I'm trying to see if we can work with the idea of African Americans um, as people seeking some type of political refuge with regards to citizenship in Haiti. And democratic citizenship here is to highlight a different version of citizenship that is incompatible with the Herrenvolk white sort of democracy that the U.S. is building at this stage. And the reason why um, I see this as a history of Black transnationalism, and I call it revolutionary, is because um, African Americans are actively building on a promise that Haiti has made into a constitutional sort of right, which is that anyone who is of indigenous descent as well as African descent is automatically um, conferred on, given Haitian citizenship the moment they land on Haitian soil. So here again is something that I feel like hasn't been fully explored in the U.S. historiography, is this idea of free soilism, which is widely known within sort of Civil War studies in terms of conflicts leading up to the Civil War with regards to free states and states with slavery. But if anyone had ever put that into beyond sort of its theoretical implications, put it into sort of practice, it was the Haitian revolutionaries in terms of the Constitution. And the Constitution also had a statute that said uh, anyone who wanted to be Haitian had to first declare themselves black. And and again, in the historiography, this is looked at sort of as a so-called reverse racism. Anyways, I'm smirking a little bit because what is misunderstood is sort of the wide opening and broad restructuring of transforming citizenship into something whereby the wretched of the earth really becomes the one to then define what citizenship is. So, giving indigenous people, who at this point are no longer really much of a force or and have been completely subsumed by Africans and Europeans. Here you have these Africans in a way taking on that indigenous uh, conception of the land and of the space to sort of rewind history and reclaim their heritage as right next to that of Africans in terms of people who are trying to redefine um, these concepts of modernity, citizenship, nationalism, and all this stuff. And on top of that, to demand that one first declare oneself black, if you want to be a citizen, is really here to borrow from contemporary outlooks, and this is not in any way to be anachronistic. It, it's to say, at the end of the day, the wretched, the despised, the hated, the mistreated, and the abused, historically, those marginalized groups, until they get to be the ones to sort of define citizenship. And it's not by hierarchical constructions either. It's just by reversing our understanding of what inclusion means more universally. Here, because one did not actually um, have to be black to be Haitian. And part of why they came up with this tool that was sort of radically embracive of anyone is because of the experiences of Polish soldiers who had fought in the Haitian Revolution. So, um, and right next to that, there is the the issue of property. So Haitians also constitutionally prohibited property from white men, right? So there's a lot at work here. But anyhow, I believe African Americans are really sort of engaging these ideas and revolutionary concepts emerging in Haitian nation building and state making and in this period. Okay, so for me, the idea of the exilic nationalists who exported the fight for equality abroad suggests that those who immigrated to Haiti occupied a complex status in the space between nationalism and transnationalism. Black identity has always, for me, been a concept in flux. On the one hand, circumstances that virtually rendered free black people aliens at home shaped their response to a sense of self exile to Haiti, not necessarily to become Haitians, but to use Haiti as a platform whereby to demonstrate what genuine democratic citizenship looks like. And at the center of this is really this question of can one really abide by certain racial concepts, as in the context of the Haitian case of declaring oneself black, while at the same time, this is supposed to be sort of a radically anti-racist and universalist approach to citizenship. Is that possible? And in some degree, am saying the immigration experience as well as the revolutionary ideology of Haitian revolutionaries at this time does make it a good case for why that is indeed possible. So on the other hand, you have the push factor of the domestic racism that drove so 5 more minutes that drove them to immigrate did not in itself shatter their sense of belonging in the U.S. They became citizens in exile or foreign national refugees. This duality further reinforces their bilateral attachment to citizenship as recognition of their humanity and natural birthright, that in alliance with Haitian revolutionaries provided a confirmation that of their blackness as integral to all the discourses that were happening with regards to um, freedom. Okay, so uh, lastly, I want to sort of I and further as my book I'm putting together will argue, Black nationalism in the 19th century was itself a variant of American nationalism, attached to defending Black inclusion in state and national politics. So color in itself was not mutually exclusive to identifying with American nationality. And perhaps no other historian encapsulates the striving for equality within these dual bounds more succinctly than W.E.B. Du Bois did in Souls of Black Folk, as I quote him here. And this longing to merge the African Americans' double self into a better and truer self, Du Bois argues Black Americans simply wish to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American. And Haiti, with its sort of conceptual restructuring and redefinition of citizenship, was where one in which one could indeed make it possible to be both and, right? So this fact added a contentious element to what were seemingly irreconcilable conflicts between African Americans and their Haitian hosts, who sometimes did not understand that voluntary immigration to Haiti did not entail rejection of the United States as land of heritage or a place where they indeed wanted inclusion. Okay, so to close here, I just want to uh, quickly say a word about why I think this vision of reworking thinking, racial thinking about citizenship within the project of immigration generated alternative claims to citizenship. Um, uh, did ultimately reach a pinnacle after the Civil War when lawmakers during Reconstruction expanded the boundaries of citizenship and designated the federal government a guardian of civil rights through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So, in many ways, I believe immigration in both its Black nationalist context and as a challenge to establish norms of uh, undemocratic citizenship was, as I will intend to show in the book, an antecedent to the struggle to reformulate, to this very struggle of the radical reconstruction to reformulate new understandings of citizenship. The movement advanced a sophisticated version of citizenship that rejected the once uh, fixed and white supremacy and transformed it into an ideologically malleable concept, capacious and amicable enough to accommodate multiple communities and a shared American political culture. By centering immigration as a forerunner to the revolutionary currents in Black transnationalism, I think we can uncover the earliest expressions of the African American radical tradition um, to uh, to a sense of American liberty that is not bounded just by a provincial frame of what it means to be a people in one society, but one that truly brings the certain Enlightenment concepts to the fore, as Haiti had done. So uh, I'm gonna stop here and let um, Professor Penslar respond a little bit. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Should the screen sharing be still on,
Oh
or?
yeah, let me turn it off. Sorry.
Great. Thank you, Wes, for the presentation and for the prospectus, which was really fascinating. Thank you, Siobhan, for organizing this, and thank you, Magda, for conceiving of the seminar and for inviting me. I think this is really a great opportunity, and I've learned a huge amount. From reading the prospectus, I guess that I could offer three kinds of observations. There'd be observations on the project in its own right, and then there would be those on how the project throws new light on the course of modern Jewish history, particularly that of Zionism and Israel, and conversely, how the history of Zionism and Israel could then illuminate the project. So let me start with the first, and just some questions coming from ignorance. One is, this is a story very much about the United States Black community. Is it at this time the only global player in this very transnational story of 19th century emigration to, or discourse on emigration to, Haiti? The two are not exactly the same. And if not, was the American movement unique for the political valence that it attached to emigration, which is not the usual rationale for migrating, such as escaping persecution or poverty, or seeking out better economic opportunities? As you explained convincingly, there's something else going on here. Second, you referred in the prospectus and in your presentation just now, you referred to tensions between Black immigrants to Haiti, or those who favored it, and the American Colonization Society, which for a mix of racist and humanitarian grounds favored Blacks going to Africa, to Liberia, which you mentioned previously, or Sierra Leone. How did Black American proponents of emigration to Haiti conceive of Liberia? You mentioned that the immigration rates are higher to, considerably higher to Haiti. But then what does Liberia mean? Does Liberia have a negative connotation? And if so, what is it? The third question has to do with this concept of revolutionary transnational nationalism, which is really an interesting idea. Its goal is less the construction of a new national or racial utopia for those who live there than to benefit, well, it's not really so much about benefiting the immigrants, but about transforming the immigrants' country of origin. That the Haitian Republic had a symbolic and apologetic value, exemplifying both the capacity of Blacks for enlightened self-government and the ability of a truly Republican form of government to honor Black citizenship. In other words, the message of the Haitian immigration movement was both critique and apologetic. And I'm interested in this relationship between these two rhetorical forms. Apologetic and critique are very different, but they seem combined here. Fourth, the number of immigrants, as you say, was small, but the significance lay in Black Americans' construction of a critique of inequity and hypocrisy in the very foundation of the American Republic. And the use by the Haitian immigration movement to use nationalism as a means of asserting the right to stay, as it were, rather than a desire to leave. Given all that, can you say a bit more about how those Black Americans who did go to Haiti, how did they perceive of themselves as expatriates rather than as having come home? Because you mentioned this a bit, and the concept of expatriation, I think, is kind of interesting here. So let me talk a little bit now about how the project illuminates and in turn is illuminated by the history of modern Jewry, and in particular of Zionism in Israel. Now, the parallels are numerous, and they lie not only in the ideal of Haiti, as was the case for the United States itself, as a new Zion. But if I change Black to Jewish, some of your whole paragraphs can be just simply applied to the Zionist project. Like Haiti, the Zionist homeland was to be both, I'm quoting from you, a utopian sanctuary and the projection of respectability seen as expressible only in an authentic, but I would say Jewish republic. I mean, these ideas are spot on. That concept of authenticity that you raise, and which lies at the core of Du Bois' appreciation for Haiti, was one of the Zionist project's most hallowed goals: to give Jews the opportunity to be authentic, to be true to themselves, to speak a Jewish language, to live by the Jewish calendar, to be immersed in Jewish culture, to follow Jewish observance as strictly or as minimally as they wished, by their own desires, and not by external compulsion. So this is what authenticity meant. And as you say, authenticity did not necessarily mean leaving. The assertion of a Zionist identity could make one feel both fully authentic as a Jew and at home in a diaspora society. A good deal of the recent scholarship has highlighted Zionism's function as a form of diaspora nationalism, an enunciation of ethnic identity that is buttressed by pride, as Tatiana Lichtenstein wrote in a book on Zionism in interwar Czechoslovakia. It was a means of asserting one's position as a loyal citizen of the Republic by removing Jews from the much feared category of ethnic Germans. And in the United States, pre-1948 Zionism had very little to do with immigration. It was much more about a performance of civil virtue, helping to construct a model society in which the Jews' citizenship would be unqualified. As Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis said, to be a good Zionist is to be a good American, and vice versa. So it's a performative quality here. And even apparent differences between the Haitian and the Jewish cases reveal underlying connections. Haiti was not a Black homeland. Blacks in America were not in diaspora from it. Yet among Jews, something similar developed in the form of diaspora nationalist movements that could be indifferent to, if not downright hostile to, Zionism. And there are lots of forms of diaspora nationalism that the Jews came up with. And the instrumentalism you describe vis-a-vis Black discussions about Haiti or Sierra Leone or even Canada as sites of Black settlement or autonomy were also present among Jews in what was called the territorialist movement, an early 20th century competitor to Zionism that sought to establish a Jewish homeland in places as far-flung as Angola, Australia, and Alaska. Now, one big difference is that the territorialist movement, and this didn't occur to me until I was listening to your comments just now, the territorialist movement was very pragmatic and goal-oriented, and it didn't really have this idea of creating the model society, and there was a bit of it. It didn't have the idea of creating a new form of citizenship, of republicanism, which is much more prominent in Zionism. And in that sense, I think that your study and the Zionist case are more, they resonate better with each other. There are two aspects of your project that struck a particularly resonant chord with me. First, you ask, and I'm quoting you, whether a movement can operate as an anti-racist campaign while adhering to the same logic of race thinking it seeks to overthrow. And this dilemma lies at the heart of Zionism. It condemned and it rejected anti-Semitism, but it internalized many of its attributes. For example, Zionists were willing to talk about Jews in diaspora as economically unproductive or physically weak or ill or lacking in virility or lacking in civic virtue. These are all things that the Zionist movement is supposed to improve in people. And I don't know if the Haitian immigration movement has the same notion of improvement. I understand the idea of citizenship, that we're going to show a model of citizenship, but is there an element of improvement that you will become a better person, you know, a stronger person? I think that the different situations of African Americans and Jews might be so vast that the similarities don't really apply. But there's an even more obvious link, which is the Zionist project created a state in which Jews are privileged, both by law and in common social and economic practice. And you can't declare yourself a Jew the way one could declare oneself a Black. In Haiti, if you declare yourself a Jew, you have to undergo a conversion, and it's a much more complicated process. Citizenship in Israel is not reserved to Jews alone, but only Jews benefit from guaranteed citizenship upon immigration. That's since the nationality law of 1952. And a 2018 basic law of the state of Israel, which has constitutional status, states explicitly that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people, with Jews alone having rights of self-determination in the country. That is, Zionism conceived of itself as a liberation movement, and it has had that function. But it has liberated one member or members of one national group by expelling and expropriating and oppressing another. And that point leads to a second area of resonance between your project and the case of Zionism. In a long note in your prospectus, you refer to Pal Singh's book about the foundational entangling of American nationality and citizenship with racism. The concept of the property-owning member and participant in the body politic presupposes exclusion of others who inhabit the same space but do not possess sufficient capacity or virtue for belonging. Singh is part of a larger body of literature critiquing modern liberalism as inherently exclusionary. In 19th century Europe, the excluded others were women and the poor. In frontier societies, they were aboriginals. In slave societies, they were Black. And America, being both a frontier and a slave society, excluded both. As you said, denizens, not citizens. Israel is a classic frontier society whose democratic political system is that of a pioneer community united against a common foe. It's a system that accords Arabs citizenship, but presupposes denial of incorporation of Arabs into the heart of the body politic. So there's a lot of interesting similarities, but of course, huge differences between Haiti and Israel. In Haiti, the establishment of the state did not involve the near elimination of an indigenous community. The slaves of Haiti were neither aboriginals. And it's very interesting how you talk about this assumption of a kind of aboriginal claim or indigenous claim. The slaves of Haiti were neither aboriginals nor settlers. They overthrew a colonial regime that had kept them as chattel. The Zionists in Mandate Palestine had a totally different relationship with the colonial power. The Zionists' position as conquerors and colonizers in their own right calls into question the very possibility of comparing them with anti-colonial movements, starting with that of Toussaint Louverture in 1791 and continuing to our own day. As I've argued repeatedly and maybe futilely, there is ample room for Israel in both the constellations of the colonizers and the colonized. And my final points will demonstrate that argument and its connection with Wes's project. So the Zionist leader, Theodor Herzl, who of course in some ways is like Prince Saunders, the charismatic leader, the man who creates something out of nothing, the negotiator, the man who is able to create connections. I can't even begin, I don't know anything about Prince Saunders' biography, so I can't even get into possible similarities or differences there. The contextual differences between them are vast. But what really interests me is that for Herzl, he embodied many of the qualities of the Haitian immigration movement writ large. For him, Zionism was not only a rescue operation, but it was a grand apologetic. It would demonstrate to the world the capacity of Jews to be models of good government and trailblazers of technological progress. A Jewish state would be a secular light unto the nations. Moreover, for Herzl, and this gets directly to this notion of transnational or exilic nationalism, only by leaving Europe could Jews become truly European. And he argues not all Jews will move to the Jewish state. Those who do not will henceforth live in dignity, accepted as worthy individuals, because Herzl believed that a Jewish state, by normalizing the existence of the Jews and by serving as a model, would cause anti-Semitism to disappear. The combination of revolutionary transnational nationalism and apologetics that lies at the heart of your project was also present over the course of Herzl's career. Now, there are so many other points to discuss. The concept of Blacks in the 19th century United States, as you mentioned, as a, quote, problem, like the social problem in 19th century Europe, or the Jewish problem, or the Jewish question of the same era. The ambiguity of the concept of authenticity, which always demands some level of invention and performance. And the challenges of comparing historical movements such as Haitian emigration and Zionism, formed more than half a century apart in radically different geographic and cultural environments. I look forward to talking with you about these points and with the attendees as a whole. So thank you again for this opportunity.
Derek, thank you so much. Before we move forward, I'd like to quickly ask you a question,
Sure.
because it is exactly what I do mean and see in the context of African American immigration to Haiti, which is your point about only by leaving Europe will Jews become Europeans, right? And this is the same framework here that Saunders is thinking about. Only by leaving the United States will they really become the Black American citizens that they want to be. Now, I quickly wanted to ask you whether you think Herzl would have seen the experience of American Jews as sort of an example of that, of becoming European outside of Europe.
That's a great question. And it's interesting how little American Jews entered Herzl's worldview. I mean, he was profoundly Eurocentric. And although he had emissaries who went to the United States and who founded a fairly anemic American Zionist Federation at the end of the 19th century, and he sent one man in particular to Boston who founded a Boston Jewish newspaper and founded Zionist activities, it was not really on his radar screen. And the relative comfort of Jews in the United States was not really on his radar screen. What he was thinking much more really was about creating a Jewish homeland, as he writes about in his novel Old New Land from 1902, where the lingua franca is German, where there's opera, where the one Arab character in the book has received his university education in German and speaks with a, quote, slight northern German accent. And Herzl himself writes in his diary that in the Jewish state, we will have all the comforts of home: opera, beer, pretzels, and smoked meat. He's quite specific, right? So, and he writes about creating a Europe and basically a state where he can feel comfortable, because Herzl himself was a quintessential European. And it's interesting how little America entered his worldview across the board. He was a journalist who wrote hundreds of journalistic pieces. I can only recall one. He wrote one on Mark Twain. And that's it. That's a great question. And it's really interesting why he did not include that. When he talked about Zionism, it was either persecution, like Romania, Russia, or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
or it was indignity, like German Jews, Austrian
Mm-hmm.
Jews suffering
Mm-hmm.
indignities. American Jews at the time were relatively comfortable. So that's a good point.
Yeah, so that point made me think about exactly the I had said in passing while speaking that part of there would be tensions and conflicts that emerge between Haitians on the one hand and African Americans, and part of that comes from the fact that I think on the part of the Haitian revolutionaries, they're not fully understanding the project in terms of its complexity. There's this notion that I don't not necessarily assimilation, but sort of integrating within the Haitian self-determination project. Okay, self-determination is agreed on both sides by both parties, but there you have the cultural, political aspect, which you just pointed out in the sense of Herzl, which is um, uh, we, like I said, these black men are Afro-Saxons first and foremost.
Right.
So as Afro-Saxons, there's an idea that there is this idea of improvement that you asked about. So to answer that question, the idea of improvement in this case, as far as African Americans are concerned, is we will display all the aspects of civilization um, while abroad. And that is part of what will be projected back onto the homeland for how we are rehearsing um, our standing as dignified individuals who can contribute. So, in some ways, this calls for, um, you know, doing away with the Catholic tradition of
Mm.
Haiti, which would later become the official state religion of Haiti, and also looking down on Haitian Vodou practices that were very indigenous to the African homelands. So in a way, many of those same comforts were being reimagined as being lived abroad.
Right.
And so I borrowed this term Afro Saxons from can't recall the historian, but I feel like it really explains some of that conflict of they're not going to Haiti to become Haitians. They're going to Haiti as a platform to
Right.
rehearse who they are as American and how to shape that. So, and to also answer the question about improvement, as far as Haitians were concerned, uh, African Americans would also bolster their claim on the international stage by not only creating alliances diplomatically, but also bringing, especially free Black Americans, bring certain trade skills and practices with them. Now, among Haitian, among Haitian leaders, for instance, King Henry of the North, who was very much an Anglophile and rejected almost everything about France. Um, the reason why the British abolitionists are involved in this here is this um, Anglo connection that he was trying to make. By bringing in African Americans, there's a way in which he was envisioning a state where English ultimately, not French, would become the language. And also, there is this performance um, that you have talked about, this performance of civilization, except it would be done through sort of the British embrace, which of course African Americans are understood as interlocutors in this phase. So both sides are looking at this within the context of improvement too. But one thing I'm learning from you here that I plan to sort of incorporate into this, which I hadn't thought about much, is the apologist aspect. There is a lot of the project ultimately involved. I mean, to use Haiti as a platform, uh, sometimes really just sees it as a tool in the box, and nothing other than that. And this is not to say they didn't understand the significance of Haiti. They understood precisely its significance, and and thought they could use it to their advantage, uh, uh, to make certain apologies to where they were coming from. So I really like this concept of an apology, and uh, I love the many sort of connections that you made, and one of those that I wanted to talk about is the liberation aspect. So while the Jewish state is conceived as a liberation project, just as the immigration project was conceived of too, I guess the difference here is um, it was not restricted to one people in terms of the liberation aspect. Uh, Nor the national contingencies of it, nor the aspect of who receives citizenship. And I think that has a lot to do with what you pointed out, which is Black people are neither indigenous to Haiti. The only connection is like both people are indigenous to the African homeland. And indigeneity though is being both bolstered by reclaiming the suffering of Native Americans and their struggle as similar to that. So here then they get indigeneity to work in their favor. And the other sort of specific historical context that differs them in the context of liberation is because Haiti could not just sort of theoretically construct these concepts to work for it. They also came out of need-based solutions that they had to develop, given, say, for instance, the presence of Polish Haitians. How do you deal with them? So, in that sense, um, uh, there is an indigenous reclaim of the native, uh, and as well as a broad opening for everybody else who comes in. And because Haiti, in that sense, is being seen as an open slate,
Mm-hmm.
rather than say the many colonial dynamics that had already existed, and the sort of borderland aspect that you brought up for us with regards to Israel, and that really I hadn't thought about that connection, the different sort of historical experiences and how that changed the solution or the outlook for what Zionism would be. And I wanted to respond to your question. How did Black American proponents of Haiti see Liberia? Well, the thing about Liberia is it was too strongly associated, both in reality as well as in their mind, with a sense of with a racist project in terms of the American Colonization Society, as well as the fact that even though it borrowed this many same elements of this Afro-Saxonism idea that I was speaking about, it also had a tinge of we are sending you back to a dark space, the dark continent, and no civilization, and also the prejudices of African Americans with regards to that um, also meant that they lean more towards Haiti, which, in spite of its African pride and self-determination, was also classically engaged in recreating sort of a modeled European state in terms of uh, monarchy or emperor and all of that class things that, from the perspective of Prince Saunders, he saw as projects of civilization, right? So Africa would not feature in people's minds until much later, and also there was a perspective that Haiti is of our choosing. We chose Haiti. It wasn't forced on us. And in fact, the invitation was made directly by Haitian leaders, right? And there's this understanding that we are in a struggle that has global implications for how Black people are understood as citizens. And if Haiti fails in that project, then we fail. We most likely will fail in the international stage as well as the national stage. So Liberia, not having had that sort of revolutionary past, did not feature as prominently in their mind in that way.
Makes sense.
Uh,
I don't know, Magda, with the time, I have three questions that respond to what Wesley just said, and then one final question that
Yes,
deals.
please do. We're cutting close, but go for the conversation is fascinating. So I think we should continue.
Okay. So one thing I'm thinking of is how in Zionism, there's a deep contradiction between the idea of losing whatever diasporic identity you had. It's called the Sabra ideal, becoming the kind of tough, strong, virile, and I'll get to that in just a second, Israeli, speaking Hebrew and giving up diaspora languages and so forth, and particularly for Jews of Middle Eastern origin, who are supposed to give up any hint of Arabness. But then there's still also the idea of retaining, like we said earlier, European civilization, sophistication. For example, to be a Polish Jew in Israel was considered a compliment, with Polish and Poland being associated with sophistication and style. So there's a real tension there between giving up cultural aspects and retaining them. But the thing that really strikes me is the kind of geopolitical aspect of what you were saying just now. I realize that when we're talking about comparisons between, the immigration movement to Haiti, which covers decades, and Zionism, which we can talk about anything from the 1880s really to, I don't know, the present. It sounds like we really are talking about two comparison situations. One is with the early back to Haiti immigration movement and early Zionism, so the Zionism of Herzl. And the other is with 1948, 49, 50, the early state of Israel. Why? Because in your case, it's an encounter with a young state. Haiti has had its revolution, the states, right, the two, they exist. And you have an authority structure, and they're dealing with all the problems that you're talking about, and they invite people to come. And in Israel, it's something similar. What will be our position towards people outside of Israel? What will be our position towards the diaspora? And then you talked about the international community. And it's a huge part of the early Israeli state's discourse. They want to be neutral. They want to forge all kinds of alliances that they aren't really allowed to because of the Israeli-Palestinian and Arab-Israeli conflict. They're excluded from the realm of the non-aligned states at Bandon. And then they wind up making their alliances with the West. But that whole question of this is now a state, a very young and vulnerable state, and it needs protectors. And who are we going to turn to? That's actually more 1948 than it is 1897. And the last point really has to do with gender, that to what extent this whole project of back to immigration, not only in terms of demography of who moves, but the language of citizenship, is this a language also of masculinity and virility, or is it a kind of a bi-gendered language or gender neutral? Because Zionist discourse is overwhelmingly masculine about the improvement. The new Jew, the Sabra Jew is a male. Although, I won't go into all the details, but it is largely emphasizing masculinity. That's tied up with citizenship very closely. Anyway.
Derek, I wanted to quickly say to that point about gender, there's a way in which the Haitian Immigration Project is highly suffused with sort of a gendered and masculine understanding of citizenship. Matter of fact, in the Constitution itself, it said no one is a good Haitian who is not a father, a soldier, this, that, and that. So clearly, citizenship here is only afforded to the male sex. But then on the ground, what complicates that constitutional precept for citizenship is how it operates on a day-to-day life in terms of people's experiences. For instance, African-American immigrants who came and settled in the urban areas, even though were given land, the men were required to do military service for a time before the land completely belongs to them. So that really hindered some of the visions that they had for how they would live, how they would participate in Haitian civic life. Whereas Black women who came with many of these families will have found that Haitian women were primarily the ones who regulated commerce, right? Everything from commerce in home, family economics, as well as markets, on a local scale. So many of the women then were the ones who could really live out some of these improvement ideas that folks had, and not the male, in spite of. So then it really sort of, for me, presented a problem of, well, there is another level here. What kind of economic citizenship um, that they find, and women will change their perspective of how that operated on the ground more so than in the U.S. And also later on, when Haiti, part of the struggles Haiti had to deal with is how to prevent white men, mainly sort of Europeans, who found their ways into Haitian society by intermarrying Haitian women, which then allowed them to have access to land, right? So there's a way in which the women have a political power that is not guaranteed on paper, um, but for which the men were coming to think that they were going to have access to, but are much more limited to. So this is an interesting situation in terms of the gender aspect. And I really want to speak to the contradiction of losing diaspora. I This is very true, because I think with the way I'm looking at the situation of African Americans, exilic nationalism for me explains the holding on to the culture while in transition, and because you don't want to lose it, or the fear, and then there's the fear of Haitians, that they might be overwhelmed by that culture. Although that's more in the South, because in the North there is a very pro-Anglo tradition, that the state is really trying to sort of enforce. So, but the idea that I may be in transition transnationally, and moving, and bodies moving, but uh, I will not lose what it means in a diasporic sense to be an American person. So that's one way I think that I need to look into the early antecedents of the movement, uh, next to this sort of state formation that you spoke about with regards to Israel in the, you know, late 1950s, I mean 1940s and 1950s. Uh, Lastly, before the international community part is so central for the Haitian counterparts in this movement. It's this very young, fragile state, always just like Israel in its early stages, um, always in conflict with neighbors, not necessarily because it has done anything to its neighbors, but because it's a constant threat that this lone singular black state exists in a sea of European empires. And it's, it says that it has no foreign policy doctrine, but free soilism is in its constitution. Uh, it's inviting black and indigenous people to claim citizenship. It is housing revolutionaries from throughout the Americas. So does it really not have an international doctrine? And it also, even when it's housing refugees from these many different parts of the Atlantic, it actually enforces its law. The moment an African American pirate, uh, not pirate, sailor jump ship to Haiti and claim citizenship, uh, there will be diplomatic sort of entries by the UK, the US, the French, but Haiti will remain resolved. And this person is Haitian. I can't do anything about it at this point, right? So, but it was very hard for Haiti to try to do this participate in this apologist project that it wants to sort of uplift its status in the community of nations, while at the same time complicating whatever ideals these its nemesis think it represented.
Mm.
So
There's so much to talk about. I have a question, but in the because we've run out of time, I won't be able to ask it, and I'll just throw it and maybe not wait for the answer. The question of power and political power. That is, Jews in Europe were accused of usurping power, and at some level Zionist movement and having, I don't know, Derek, but having a Jewish state that could exercise and be model for the Europeans of Jewish governance would have been sort of pushing back against the fear of Jewish power. And I wonder, I mean, I don't know whether the fear of Black governance or Black power West is at that point in existence, or does it only come sort of after the Reconstruction and with the post-Reconstruction era amendments that we see really articulated in the United States? So I don't know, briefly, if you want to address it. If not, I will want to just thank everybody for being here. Yeah.
Well, the fear of Black power, the fear of Black power always existed, you know, but it really was not anything, especially in the context of the United States, internally speaking. There was no reason to sort of be worried of a rise of Black power. But the moment the Haitian Revolution becomes a thing and Haiti then is established as a state, not just a revolution, as a state, it does provide problems, because many sort of, whether that be Denmark Vase's rebellion and Nat Turner and others, whether or not it was associated with Haiti, there's always this lurking fear that Haiti's there somewhere in Black people's imaginations, or that even the Haitian state itself is instigating some of these issues. So it's a fear of Black power on an international scale. And on some level, this is why sometimes I've said Haiti is a gift and a curse. On some level, the reason why, racist lawmakers are doubling down on Black mobility, Black civil rights, restricting them in commerce and all this, is because they want to sort of reinforce the idea that don't let Haiti be an example to you. It has some consequences. You will be punished, right? So there are ways in which Haiti, in a way, is causing the doubling down in this. And when you talk if we talk about geopolitics here, the doubling of the United States with the Louisiana Purchase, which is a direct consequence of the Haitian Revolution, also means over 1 million Black people, Americans now, will be trafficked in this internal slave trade, right? And indigenous people will lose their land, all in consequence to the reverberations of the Haitian Revolution. So it's a very much more international geopolitical problem of Black power.
Derek, what do you say?
Well, I could just defer to the author of the authoritative book on blood libels about fears of malevolent and conspiratorial Jewish power, but that was certainly the way that anti-Semites viewed the Zionist project during the 1930s. The worst thing you want to do is let Jews have a state, as I think, I forget now which anti-Semitic, which Nazi activist wrote that a Jewish state will be a laboratory for budding crooks, I think is what he wrote. And there was that fear, and certainly after 1948, that Jews now have an address from which they can, spread out their tentacles. But actually, that's something I want to work on in my new project on 1948, and the way that the 1948 war was actually conceived in real time, not only in the Arab world, but in the world as a whole. And maybe I'll have a better answer to that question in a few years.
Well, we'll bring you back for that.
Yes.
So I want to thank both of you for, the effort, the time, the thoughtfulness, and a really fantastic conversation that I wish we could keep going for another hour. But it was really a wonderful exchange about ideas, about nationalism, about homelands and migration and identities and citizenship. So thank you both, and thank you everybody who joined us, and I hope you'll join us for other events. Thank you.
And Derek, I have a copy of your Herzl biography, which I'm looking forward to reading soon. So
cool.
yes.
And I look forward to your book. This is great.
And when you meet, you can sign.
Yes. Great. Well, thank you. This was great.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Derek.
Thank you, Wes.
Bye.
Bye.